in order to say not the buildings, which they didn't care about, but the bottles of alcohol, of whiskey and vodka and so forth, they sacrificed a third of the city, the core of the city. This became a national scandal. It certainly was a factor that promoted the prohibition movement, but it also said there was a major problem in the United States where a private company with its own private militia could prevent public employees, the police and the firefighters, from guaranteeing public security. And that problem had to be addressed. The San Francisco earthquake and fire, which is, I think, too much emphasis is put on the earthquake. It really was the San Francisco fire, which was not a natural event, was as symbolically important at its time as Hurricane Katrina was in our time, or has been in our time. It came to represent what was fundamentally rotten with the system of in the United States that allowed people too much liberty. That there needed to be, as people had been arguing for some time, there needed to be more structure. Okay, we will now stop this. Okay, full. One of the areas, right at the exact time that the San Francisco earthquake and fire occurred, where this battle was fought out most ferociously, was the question of pure food and drugs. Okay. Now, agriculture had a particularly important place, and food as a result, in American life. It was male status in a republic was based on being able to provide food and shelter for your dependents. Self-sufficiency was most securely located in a farm, where a man's family was put to work building their common future while being able to feed themselves. Agricultural expansion during the 19th century had generated the phenomenal industrial and commercial growth of the United States. So the activities of farmers produced large quantities of cheap food. The fact that the United States, unlike many European countries, had a sufficient quantity of healthy, simple fare was underscored. But also was underscored was the lack of variety. Americans didn't need to eat a bunch of fancy food. They ate very simple, basic food. The American farm economy, in part because it was developing around the idea of export for global markets, was organized around a handful of crops that were raised in each region. These relatively few foodstuffs provided a simple but filling meal for farmers and for their customers. The American diet, thus, throughout the 19th century, was a heavily charged political symbol of the relatively high standard of living available to working people in the United States, and thus it was always difficult to change because it did represent so many things beyond food. When nutritionists and food faddists started talking about eating healthy, they were, which happened in the 1880s basically, started in the 1880s and continued, they found themselves confronting a set of practices that combined simplicity with the idea that every family should have a full meal pail, William McKinley's campaign slogan in 1896. And there were a relatively limited number of products produced and consumed: beef, wheat flour, potatoes, canned vegetables, and pickles, which were supplemented after 1900 by dairy products, lettuce, and fresh fruits. Now, what I'm showing here is from a cookbook that was published in 1912, which was providing a set of menus for average American families. And then there are recipes that follow that. So you can get a sense of what was considered a reasonable meal for breakfast and dinner. Now, dinner in that time was what we call lunch, and supper is what we call dinner. So this is what you would eat at breakfast and at lunchtime. Typically, the biggest meal of the day was at lunch, our lunch, their dinner. And then you would eat somewhat smaller portions of food after you came home from work in the evening. The major exception to the pattern of food self-sufficiency was in the cotton belt of the South. Where cotton ruled, farmers had to buy their food, thus increasing their debt loads, and hunger was a persistent problem in the South, unlike in the North and the West. Farmers did not always have time or land to devote for gardens, and this difference reinforced the distinctions between the South and the rest of the country. This also had a food dimension, with people in the South eating more pork, more corn grits, and maybe more collard and mustard greens. In a place like California, which had a heavily industrialized agriculture, with large plantations growing wheat and rice for export, medium and small-sized farmers would produce the sort of regular consumer goods that people in the local community would eat. And they would be located in the less valuable land, but close enough to get to the major towns and cities. When refrigerated railroad cars developed, it actually became more profitable to grow things like tomatoes and lettuce and cucumbers than wheat. And the way the tax structure was organized, the large wheat growers, who were amongst the wealthiest people in the entire world, found themselves having to pay taxes for land as if they were growing spinach or tomatoes or lettuce, but unable to grow those products because you can't grow them. At that time, you couldn't grow them in the kind of industrial agriculture. It required smaller farms. Miller Lux, which was one of the largest companies in the world, was forced to the edge of bankruptcy. It started selling off its land, and California became, after the 1890s, a land primarily of small and medium-sized farmers growing fruits and vegetables and nuts for sale to back east or to other countries. But that's a 20th century phenomenon. In the 19th century, Americans did not eat much in the way of fresh fruits and vegetables. It would have been considered weird if you did. An apple a day, that famous slogan, really meant an apple turnover a day or a slice of apple pie a day. But it not only would it have been considered weird, it would have been considered unhealthy, with raw foods clearly being a major source of indigestion and oftentimes of food poisoning. So a simple, filling, plain-cooked meal defined healthy eating. If it had been cooked to death, that meaning any possible germs in there would have died probably an hour before you ate it. Then it would, then it was a really tasty meal. Yes? I don't think so. But maybe you would pluck it right off the tree. I don't know. It doesn't seem to be the case from what I've read. The idea of fresh fruits and vegetables is something that emerges at the end of the 19th century and really takes off at the 20th century. One of the things that we ought to keep in mind is nobody knew the existence of vitamins until 1921. That's when when vitamins were discovered. And then it was understood, you need to eat fruits and vegetables to get vitamins. Ironically, the primary beneficiaries of that was the canning industry, because so they would they increased their canning of fruits and vegetables, tomatoes and canned peaches in particular, on the idea that you should eat a couple of cans of tomatoes and canned fruits every day so you could get enough vitamins. But at this point, the scientists had not figured out that cooking stuff at 800 degrees Fahrenheit for 20 minutes, which is the legal requirement for canned foods, would kill would destroy all the vitamins. So it's really the 1930s and 1940s that people begin to change their food habits in terms of looking for more fresh foods. A second week of diets. Now, that breakfast, fresh fruit might in fact be slightly cooked with sugar, what we would today is sometimes called compote. Anyway. So you gobbled down enough well-cooked food to feel stuffed. And the contentment that a full stomach gave you meant you were doing okay. And so fresh fruits and vegetables were bad for you, and fat was good for you. The most expensive and the most desired cuts of meat had the most fat in it. The three basic food, we have our five, in the food pyramid, we have our five basic types of food. But at the beginning of the 20th century, the three basic foods that you needed to eat lots of were sugar, fat, and salt. Basically McDonald's. So McDonald's and Kentucky Fried Chicken are continuing ideas of food that were prevalent 100 years ago or more. So the simplicity of American fare, by and large, meant that the quality of the food should be pretty obvious. All you had to do was look at it. Beef was not produced locally generally. The Great Plains states provided the largest source of beef, which were then shipped to a few centers, Chicago first of all, but also Kansas City and Omaha and a town, I think it's called Austin, just south of Minneapolis, where the cattle were slaughtered, dismembered, and then shipped all over the world. Beef was kept fresh through refrigeration, but people were probably used to eating somewhat gamier food than we are today. Butchers continued to sell meat after it had turned rancid. They reduced the price, and this would be a factor in determining what the poorest people had available to them. They would buy the cuts that were